So I've been playing Diablo 4 pretty much every day for the last 3 weeks or so. I've got to level 100 and I'm progressing into the pit. And honestly, the changes that they've made for this patch has taken Diablo 4 from D4 bad to D4 mid. And yeah, that's going to be contentious with some people, but I really think it's true. Just the game actually being in what feels like a 1.0 state is a nice thing to do. Having some crafting options is really great because it had none of them before. And then of course, having the gear being fixed for your character and your actual playtime and your time itself not being wasted is a nice thing. However, though, there's one big problem that Diablo 4 still has, and I really don't think it's going to ever be solved by the way the developers are talking about their decisions and how they want to move forward with specific things. And that problem is still going to be the end game of Diablo 4. Now, I know some of you are saying right now at your screens, hey, hold on, they just fixed the loot. They just added the pit. You got to give them more time. You know, you can't compare it to Path of Exile. Well, you can and you can't. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say, oh, it doesn't have enough content when compared to PoE, because that's a really horrible comparison. You're comparing a game that's been out for a year to a game that's been out for 10 years plus. So yeah, you can't do that. However, what you can do is talk about how they're implementing the endgame content and what Blizzard is planning on doing comparative to what PoE has done and what they're planning on doing in the future. So hold on, let me just explain what I mean. And let's jump in game. So here we are in game, and in D4, I just want to show you guys what's actually happening and why I feel there's a major problem. I've progressed into the pit rather quickly. In fact, right now I am in tier 63 from what I'm seeing here. I'm farming Neatheron because I'm trying to get all of my gear into the third tier of 8 to 12. The thing is though, I just don't care anymore. I really just do not care anymore. To go into these sections, to gear this up in the way that I wanted to do to again progress into that area, yeah, it would be fine and dandy if I wanted to just to get the higher number. But in reality, what is that actually doing for me as a player character? I get a 25% bonus to my stats, and then I get a masterworked item that I can have one specific stat be masterworked that specific amount of time for that percentage. Great. Okay, but then what am I going to do with it? I'm going to go fight Uber Lilith, which is already a broken mechanic fight anyways that doesn't really work correctly. No, because even then that fight is just really badly designed compared to everything else that you've got in other ARPGs. Fighting the Uber versions of the other bosses, sure, but what's the point? They already have the same loot table than all the other ones do, so really wasting my time fighting the Uber variants of those actual bosses does nothing for me either way. The grind in the pit has no actual meaning besides getting your gear masterworked to the highest level, and once you're done with that, you're basically done. You don't really have to progress any further into the pit if you don't want to. And the problem is, once you're done progressing in the pit with all of that stuff, where are you going to really test it? Because there's no other pinnacle bosses to really test it on. Like I said, the Uber variants of Duriel and Dariel and the other ones have the same loot drop table that their regular variants do. So why am I going to farm the Uber versions when I can just farm the regular versions? The end game for Diablo 4 is honestly twofold. One, why am I doing this? I can't just do it to get better gear because I should be getting better gear regardless. And two, when I get the better gear, where am I going to actually test to see if it's been an improvement? Sure, getting to level 200 in the pit is a nice thing, but if I have to fight the same Sea Hag boss 200 times, or the same tree boss that spits poison on me the second I walk into the arena, or that same other skeleton ghost boss every single time, and all I have to do really is just move out of the way of the other mechanics that happen and just let my corpse explosions do the work, then what is really the point of this? Like there's nothing really here to test me as a player, whether it's completely overtuned and doesn't make any sense mechanically because the game has major issues on that side, or it's totally undertuned and on that end I blow through it far too easily. So there's really nothing in the middle or a reason for me to actually go through and do any more of this kind of content. I've basically just hit like this, okay, we're done. We're done. And really, I don't want to just come with problems. I want to show up with solutions. Let's talk about the first thing Blizzard could actually do to breathe new life into the end game of Diablo 4, and that is to make adjustments or just an overhaul to nightmare dungeons. As of right now, the moment that you walk into a nightmare dungeon and you've already cleared all of that content and you've upgraded all of your glyphs, there is literally no point to going back and doing anything else. Everything's level 21 for me. I don't have to go back to a nightmare dungeon ever again. Why would I ever go back and do a level 100 nightmare dungeon when I don't have anything that's going to benefit me from doing that? One thing they can definitely do is provide crafted modifiers for your nightmare dungeons. They can take a page out of PoE's playbook and increase item quantity and item quality depending upon the actual sigil that you're crafting and what modifiers you have on there. Increasing the amount of actual materials required for you to get a very high-end, high-tiered nightmare dungeon should also give you the benefits for that. Instead of just having a random RNG drop of loot show up, have it so where that the actual modifiers that increase item quantity and item quality will then apply to bosses. So when I'm fighting these bosses, if I go into tier 100 nightmare dungeons and I've modified them and I've crafted onto them with the sigil crafting, or I've invested actual amounts of currency that I have in overabundance in this game for no particular reason into that actual nightmare sigil, then I should be able to get like multiple greater affixes on my gear. Instead of just having one, I get a guarantee to get 2 or maybe even 3 greater affixes on that gear instead as well, providing me a reason to go in, number 1, a nightmare dungeon after getting my glyphs all taken care of, but also finding a way to actually do something with all of these materials. I have all of these sigils, like I've got almost 1,000 all of these to do nothing. There's no way I'm going to upgrade enough rings, weapons, necklaces, or armor in order to actually go ahead and use almost 800 to 1,000 of these actual sigils. I should be able to use them and craft them into a specific nightmare dungeon sigil and then provide that and say, here's the kind of gear I'm looking for. Here's what I want to target farm for this kind of gear using these sigils. And then can that gear, depending upon how far I juice that sigil for a nightmare dungeon, provide me a piece of armor that has many other greater affixes that I can then craft onto as well? That would be a good reason. That's one of the big things about PoE is that you can go in, you can target farm, you can juice maps, you can say, hey, this is what I want to look for. Here's how I want to look for things, and then go that direction. That would be a good way of doing it too. You could also do that for the pit as well. But we can get to the pit later. I want to still talk about nightmare dungeons. There should also be a tier of Uber Nightmare Dungeon or pinnacle version of these nightmare dungeons from level 100 to level 200 as well. If you're going to be doing that kind of a thing, you definitely want to increase the ability for those actual sigils to be worth something. You can also make a return or an actual item currency dump for these specific things. To craft them, you need to go ahead and farm either the standard bosses or get items and gear or stuff from the pit or Hell Tides and then bring it together and say, hey, here's where I want to farm, here's what I want to do, and then move from that direction. You guys had a full-on real ability to have a very casual version of PoE maps, but you chose to not go in that direction and move into a very lazy level 200 pit system. Because right now I have all of this currency that I'm never really going to have a problem having to farm or basically need, and it's just going to sit in my bank, and I'm never going to touch nightmare dungeons ever again as a level 100. I'm going to focus on the pit so I can get Neathrion and get some more scattered prisms, get more resplendent sparks, stuff like that, and work in that direction. And with all of that being said, I really feel like nightmare dungeons need a way to target farm specific greater affixes or items with multiple greater affixes by investing the actual crafting item and currency that you normally have just stocked up for no particular reason because you're never going to use it, and then be able to target farm that and juice those nightmare dungeons to a specific level, so that way you're being challenged after going into the pit and upgrading all your gear with masterworking to then really test yourself in that direction. The great thing about PoE is you start as a nobody on a beach and you end up basically one-shotting all these eldritch gods. We don't have that here. What we have is you can then kill all these bosses, go to the pit, and then you've got Uber Lilith, which is all the way out here, and you're like, well, where's the steps in between? How do we get there? That's what we really got to work on with this game. But with that being said, let's talk about the pit. So the pit here, as you can see, I'm level 63. I've basically just stopped caring to farm because I have no real reason to go anything further with this here. Now, one of the big things you can absolutely do with the pit is basically spread out the actual amount of levels you need for each specific kind of crafting material. The 30, 60, 90 approach works really well, which I can definitely understand why you guys chose to do that way. So from level 1 to 30, you get the orbs, then from level 30 to 60, you get Ingolith, then from 61 to 100, you get Neathrion, right? Awesome, that's a great idea. But the difference is, once you're done in those levels, you only go from level 101 to 200 to do what exactly? All you're really doing at that point in time is just juicing whatever you can, getting 1 or 2 more percentage points that you possibly can in your gear or items, and then possibly hoping for items to drop with greater affixes. So here's my idea for the pit, and jump on this roller coaster with me, okay? I want to have both of these sort of endgame mechanics intertwine with each other. Here's what I mean. When you're done with level 100 in your nightmare dungeons, you're basically ready for the pit, which makes sense. But I still want to be able to provide players to be able to target farm. So what happens is this. Once you get to level 100 in the pit, you then go from 101 to 200. Now from 101 to 200, you would then start getting those materials that you would need to create those Uber Nightmare Dungeon versions or target farm those versions. So you can then say, okay, here's all the materials that I need for these Nightmare Dungeons. Here's the actual Nightmare Dungeon that I want to run. Here's the materials that I need. And then you can go from there. So you can do another 30, 60, 90 in your actual pit for level 100 to 200, and then provide those materials to say, okay, here's 101 to 130, 131 to 160, and then 161 to 200 of level Nightmare Dungeons, which then give you huge amounts of greater affix items, huge amounts of actual uniques, the ability to do all of those things, and then give you a reason to go back and forth between Nightmare Dungeon and the pit. If you get stuck in a level of the pit, you can then use the materials that you've earned from the pit to juice up Nightmare Dungeons, to then get better gear, to then go back to the pit, to then masterwork that gear, to then progress even further. So you're constantly jumping back and forth between those two specific things in order to make sure that you are then progressing and you consistently feel like you're moving forward in some direction. Not as if like, oh, this content is now irrelevant to me, I don't want to do it anymore. Instead, we're jumping back and forth. It's almost like the idea of when you have an Atlas tree and Path of Exile, and instead of just picking one kind of endgame mechanic or endgame set of content, like if you pick Abyss, you would then pair that with something like Legion, or you would pair that with an Eater of Worlds mechanic where you would have the altars on that side too. So you're not just doing one thing, you're having one mechanic feed into another while having to do both at the same time, and then it gives you a purpose as if like, oh, I can then reach this goal to then head to this goal to then go from there, and I can use this mechanic to feed into this other one, and then now everything is coming together and working together. So what do we do with that now? Well, if Blizzard still wants to keep Uber Lilith the way she is, I can somewhat understand that, but I really feel like that actual boss fight needs to be tuned correctly. What they can also do is change the loot tables for Endariel and also for Duriel and the other Uber variants of those bosses. I understand that they want people to go ahead and say, hey, we can clear this dungeon. I can't get to Ubers just yet. Here's what I can clear. I'm not saying to remove items from that loot drop table. It's no. What I want to have happen though, is if you're doing the Uber variants of those bosses, all of those uniques have the ability to have 2, 3, or even 4 plus greater affix modifiers onto those items. So not only are they Uber uniques in general, but they're Uber uniques with a guaranteed better chance of getting those greater affixes onto that Uber unique so that you can craft up that Uber unique even higher and then go into that other stage. Having those chase items and having the ability to say, hey, I want to farm these Ubers, here's a reason to do it. Not only do I get it from the pit materials, not only am I getting better gear from Nightmare Dungeons, not only am I getting what I need, but having a Shaco with 4 greater affixes that I can then go back into the pit with and then use that to craft that Shaco up to a higher tier and then possibly even do something crazy with it would be ideal to do. That gives someone a chase item, not just in the end game of like, oh, I got a Shaco, but says, hey, how do I take this to the next level? So now you have people wanting to do Ubers, even though they're going to be like, I have to invest more time into this, but still provides them a reason to do it. So instead of changing the loot table completely, because I know this is a more casual game, you have the ability to have people who are very high end say, okay, I can really juice this character up. I can really get somewhere crazy if I invest the time into the pit, into these Uber Nightmare Dungeons, and then I can go ahead and do what I want. There's honestly nothing wrong with having a person go in and have a ton of fun, invest themselves into the game, into the actual endgame mechanics, and then have the ability to say, look what I can do, press 1, everything explodes, ta-da. Like, that's a cool thing because look, check out what I did. Now can I do that with another character? That's a nice thing to do. So you know what? Those are just my quick thoughts about the endgame for Diablo 4. If you think my ideas are good, let me know. If you think they're bad, let me know. If you have other ideas as well, just put them down in the comment section below. Love to find out and see what we can actually give to Blizzard to say, hey, maybe you guys can work on this, because they have been listening to feedback, which is really nice. But the one thing is clear, I've loved Diablo since I was a young guy, especially from Diablo 1 when I was like 15 playing that, and then Diablo 2 back in high school. This series means a lot to me. And even though it's a more casual ARPG, that's perfectly fine. I'm not having issues with that. I still feel like they need to provide some way of actual hardcore ARPG enjoyers to go in and have something more to do rather than just leveling the pit and doing something else. Because honestly, it's been incredibly boring to do that, and it feels more like a grind with no purpose rather than an actual reason to do it. But hey, you know what? That's just one guy's thoughts. With that being said though, if you guys like this kind of content, subscribe to the channel. We are getting close to 500 subs, and I just want to say thank you guys very much. This is more of like a passion project channel for me, and I really do appreciate it. Now, if you want to see more, subscribe like I said before. I'm doing more Path of Exile guides and more tutorials for beginners. I'm doing more Last Epoch stuff, more Diablo stuff, and even more Torchlight stuff. So anything that's ARPG related will be right here on this channel. So if you want to see more of that, subscribe. With all that being said, y'all, thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you have a great one, and I'll see you next time.